ago.
Okay, wonderful. Okay, thank you everyone for joining us today, and welcome to the Oregon Dialogue on a Green Recovery, Climate Solutions, and Just Transitions. I'm Liandra Chapman. I'm a senior economics student at Willamette University.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Don Negri, professor of economics at Willamette University. Liandra and I are co-organizers and moderators of this event. Over the next few days, there will be over 100 webinars going on in 45 countries across the world, all focusing on how to solve climate change by 2030, with an emphasis on a just transition and infusing climate change education into our schools. These webinars will provide local and individual actions we can all do to help solve climate change here in Oregon and around the world.
This webinar is scheduled to run from 6 to 7:30, and the agenda for today is to first watch a 5-minute video provided by Dr. Eben Goodstein, the National Project Leader and Director for the Bard Center for Environmental Policy at Bard College. Next, we will hear from our 3 panelists on their areas of expertise, and then finally, there will be time for audience Q&A. If you have questions throughout the webinar, you may send them through the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and we will ask them at the end. You should also be able to upvote questions that you are particularly interested in, and this will make them rise to the top where we can address them first. Okay, and then I also want to give just a big thank you to Solve Climate by 2030, our interns, the panelists who have joined us today, and really everyone who helped us put this webinar together and promote this event. And without further ado, we will go ahead and play the video. Okay.
Welcome to the Solve Climate Global Dialogues. You're participating in one of 125 events held across the planet, including in almost all 50 US states, part of a global project called Solve Climate by 2030. My name is Eben Goodstein, and I'm an economist and director of the Graduate Programs in Sustainability at Bard College in New York, the lead organizer for Solve Climate. This last year has been difficult for everyone. As the world looks forward to recovery from COVID, we are focusing tonight on the most important question facing humanity. What can we do in this year in our regions to help solve climate change while supporting struggling communities that have faced widespread loss of life, economic disaster, and joblessness? Worldwide, from Australia to Kyrgyzstan, from Colombia to Malaysia, and from South Carolina to South Africa, Solve Climate audiences are hearing from local experts and young leaders about concrete steps that can really help nations solve climate change while creating much needed jobs and incomes for everybody. The year 2020 was one of the 2 hottest years in human history, bringing with it massive forest and grassland fires, record-breaking storms and hurricanes, and relentless rising seas. Solving climate is the challenge which the human species must now face. There's hope for the future. Solutions have continued to advance. This year, China committed to building a carbon neutral economy, while the US rejoined the Paris Agreement. Solar, wind, and battery prices continue to fall, while major car companies have been rushing to electrify the global fleet. Worldwide, movements for Black Lives Matter and Me Too are leading in bringing much delayed and urgently needed justice to the world. Time is short. We have until 2030, 10 years to solve climate. We can get a lot done in this decade. We have the solutions, but only if we focus the world on climate solutions and justice, and then do the work we have to do in our own cities and regions. For students listening, you are the leaders. Without you, the future we envision will not come. I'm asking tonight for your help. We're going to discover powerful ideas for climate solutions and climate justice and how you can be a part of the solution. But this message must reach beyond those of us who are listening right now. Would you ask all your teachers this week in every subject to make climate a class? The teacher can assign tonight's webinar's homework for the students, and then afterwards have a one-class period discussion. And we mean every subject, from art to engineering, psychology to business, dance to chemistry. Teachers don't need to be a climate expert to lead a discussion about climate change. The Solve Climate Project has easy-to-use teacher's guides in nearly every subject and in 3 languages to help teachers make climate relevant to their class. It only takes courage. Don't take no for an answer. Ask them, why not? This is your future. You'll be surprised how many teachers will say yes and thank you. Imagine you, thousands of leaders like you around the world asking their teachers once every school term to make climate a class. That means every term going forwards, hundreds of thousands, millions of students worldwide in their classes talking about climate solutions. COVID has shown how fragile our global economy and society are to extreme events. It's also shown that vulnerable people are facing the hardest, most damaging impacts. This is also true with climate change. Science has made it clear that unchecked, global warming will mean an unending onslaught of extreme events, causing untold suffering for humanity and all creatures, species driven to extinction, a planet of environmental refugees. And yet, in many ways, this is the most exciting time to ever be alive as a human. We have the tools and networks and technologies to rewire the world with clean energy, reimagine the global food system, reinvent transportation, and regenerate forests and grasslands, and be well on our way to solving climate by 2030. Tonight, we will learn how to do this in our own cities, our own towns, our own regions. Thank you for the work you will do to promote climate solutions and a just world.
We have 3 speakers for you today. The first will be Aaron Brown, and I believe you can see their names on the pictures they have on the screen. Aaron Brown is co-founder of No More Freeways, a grassroots campaign to stop Oregon Department of Transportation's $800 million freeway expansion in the backyard of I-5. He's held leadership roles in municipal and regional electoral campaigns that have raised $2.7 billion in funding for schools, teachers, sidewalks, and parks. Aaron is the former board president of Oregon Walks, the state's pedestrian advocacy organization, and he is head coordinator to host a national conference advocating for abundant housing. He volunteers with several Portland organizations working at the intersection of housing, climate, and transportation justice. Aaron holds a bachelor's degree from Macalester College.
Okay, our second panelist is Victoria Paykar. She works for Climate Solutions, a Northwest-based clean energy nonprofit. She brings a racial justice lens working on elevating holistic transportation solutions, developing a strategic and equitable transportation agenda for electrification, transitioning off fossil fuels, and advocating for people-centered transportation policies. Prior to joining Climate Solutions, she was an Environmental Equity Fellow at the Green Lining Institute and the Transportation Equity Associate at Center for Sustainable Energy. In those capacities, she worked on programs and policies to deliver equitable and intersectional climate benefits to low-income and communities of color. Ms. Paykar earned a master's in international relations and environmental policy from University of California, San Diego.
Our third speaker is James Valdez. Mr. Valdez works for the City of Portland Bureau of Planning and Sustainability, focused on the launch of groundbreaking Portland Clean Energy Community Benefits Fund. Before this position, James worked for Spark Northwest, where he covered regulatory, market, and legislative policy issues and worked to create communities powered by affordable, locally controlled clean energy. He has more than 15 years experience in energy issues, including energy planning, utility marketing, and public advocacy towards an equitable, clean energy economy. In 2012, he spent a year as a Robert Bosch Fellow in Germany, researching cooperatively funded renewable development and distributed energy integration. He holds a bachelor degree in physics and environmental studies from Willamette's competitor, Whitman College. Aaron, the floor is yours.
Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you very much. I'm sharing my screens, but I haven't shared it here yet. You'd think after a year of Zoom that we would all know how to do this, right? But can folks get a thumbs up that people can see our slides? Fantastic. Hi, my name is Aaron Brown. I use he, his pronouns. I'm with co-founder of an organization called No More Freeways. I'm going to start my timer just so that way I shut up when I hit my time limit. I'm here to talk about retiring the Freeway industrial complex and fighting for a Green New Deal by killing the gray old deal. I'm going to talk a little bit about who I am. I'm going to talk a little bit about why ultimately it's vital that we build communities where we think about driving less as just part of our daily lives. I'm going to talk about how I've come to that conclusion and why the science kind of moves in that direction and what it looks like to really chip away at the infrastructure that encourages driving more, including this $800 million freeway expansion currently poised in the backyard of Harriet Tubman Middle School. And, you know, really thinking about this, I hope to provide the sort of context of what I've done in the 10 years since I've graduated college as a sort of roadmap for those of you grappling with these existential questions about, yikes, the climate crisis is really terrifying and it's a huge bummer. And it's going to require all of us, especially those of us that have education and privilege and resources to really shoot the spitballs at the right locations. And I hope to use this as a chance to encourage all of you to think big about what those interventions can be. So over here on the left, you know, here's this earnest, nerdy white dude that loved bikes that graduated from college, and he was super excited about becoming this Portlandia version of a bike hipster, right? And the more I got involved with livable streets advocacy, I thought I wanted to be an urban planner. The more I did work with urban planning, the more I realized it mattered less about the technical details of the bureaucrats, although obviously planning is an amazing field and you should go into it if you're feeling it. But I was really motivated more by, well, it matters who shows up, and it matters how the table was set, and it matters who politically made the decisions about how much money is allocated for sidewalks and other things. So I went from that dude on the left to that guy in the middle that, as board president of Oregon Walks, we successfully lobbied the city to pass a Vision Zero initiative that got them to push to eliminate traffic fatalities within 10 years. Because, you know, I got hit by a car riding a bike and it sucked, it was unpleasant. But when you actually look at the epidemic of traffic violence that exists, it's disproportionately in low income communities of color with a lot of senior citizens and a lot of smaller children. Traffic violence as this epidemic, like epidemics that we're facing all over the country, are not felt evenly across depressingly predictable lines of race, class, and gender. And for someone that was comfortable enough to live in the inner city part of Portland and ride his bike around to then have to spend time in East Portland, recognizing how dangerous it is for people to just get across streets that don't have sidewalks and crosswalks, that was a really humbling experience for me in terms of just navigating and understanding what it looks like to do this advocacy thoughtfully. And then going to all those pedestrian vigils and having to speak at these unfathomably sad events, listening to these people sob that their grandmother got hit by a car and on an ODOT-owned arterial. And ODOT's like, well, we didn't have an extra $90,000 to fix a crosswalk connecting the senior citizen complex with a bus station across the street. Okay, well, there's an $800 million freeway expansion coming down the line, right? This is a question of morals and politics and priorities. And unfortunately, as we'll talk about a little bit later, it is necessary for us to identify what is that gray old deal that exists that we can therefore eliminate and eradicate it and destroy it to make space for the new world that we want to see happen, right? And I've been really motivated by this perspective of thinking of transportation advocacy as this intersectional approach, right? There was this amazing, I'll send the link out afterwards, we can post it. The curb cut effect is this notion of saying, you know, in the 70s and some of the early disability advocacy folks in Berkeley, a bunch of folks with wheelchairs made their own DIY curb cuts because they couldn't get to their classes at the University of California in Berkeley because they were upstairs or there was not sidewalks that you could get to the street. And so by creating those curb cuts, not only do these individuals with mobility devices benefit from being able to get to their classrooms, but society benefits because suddenly we have more doctors, we have more teachers. Our society is benefited by a much larger number of people getting access to resources. So as a transportation advocate, you know, when you start looking at all this traffic crash data and seeing, wow, all of the crashes happen at the intersections. And intersectional is how we're trying to frame the world from the lens of addressing race, class, and gender, as well as the climate crisis. The metaphors were just a little too obvious for me to not pick up on. And I would just say that my work as a transportation advocate has been deeply empowered by being continuing to ask myself how all of these other angles fit into this larger question. I'm going to skip over a little bit of some of the stuff on transportation decarbonization because my pal and colleague V is following up afterwards, and I'm sure we're going to have a lot of the same slides. 40%, holy smokes, 40% of Oregon's carbon emissions come from transportation. It's the only sector of our economy where emissions are growing. We got to do something about that. You may have seen some of these slides before or in places on the internet of, you know, look at how much street space that we can claim if people are just in buses instead of in cars. I would also ask you to think, you look at this image of the bus versus all those cars, think about how much energy it takes to move one bus versus moving all of those extra cars. And to be clear, you know, I'm totally on board with electrifying everything, and V's going to talk about that after me, but we also need to reduce the number of vehicle miles traveled to address air pollution, to address the amount of energy being used from all sorts of other racial and social justice initiatives as well. So I just really want to say that, like, there are these two angles that we need to go at. And one of them is like systemically eradicating the bias towards single occupancy vehicle use that has permeated American society. You know, it's easy for one person to be like, I'm going to ride my bike less and more, and I'm going to drive less. It's a whole other thing to actually build communities where biking, walking, and taking transit is the norm, right? And so, you know, the top image here is of St. John's, and the bottom, a neighborhood in North Portland. The image below is, you know, ex-urban sprawl in Vancouver. One of those neighborhoods encourages you to walk to the post office when you've got a mail to drop off. The other encourages you to drive, right? And if we don't fundamentally change those, and, you know, looking at the right, this image of Hamburg where bus lanes and transit and things happen every, you know, there's whole parts of town you just don't drive in because people have designed communities where all of your daily needs can be met without an automobile. There's simply no way around it. Even with electrifying everything, we still have to drive less. Climate smart land use and transportation policy requires building dense, walkable neighborhoods with abundant and affordable housing connected by frequent, reliable, accessible transit. And I apologize for doing the whole reading your slide thing, but this is sort of my like operating mantra at this point in my life about this is the vision of we have to address our housing policies and we have to address our transportation policies to go towards this vision in addition to electrifying everything. And I just put the logo up there of this organization, Portland Neighbors Welcome, that has been kind of really advocating for that work in the Portland region and across the state of Oregon. So, but that's the world we want to get to, but this is the world that we have. Anytime any of us are doing this work, I think we have to acknowledge that we're inheriting a very broken, racist society that was dominated by a lot of broken and racist decisions and trespasses against vulnerable and communities that were intentionally harmed. This is photos of what was the largest Black neighborhood in the state of Oregon, torn to shreds by the Oregon Department of Transportation for this entire project for suburban sprawl that was heavily subsidized by the federal government and encouraged by local government saying, yeah, sure, tear out those Black neighborhoods if it means that we can replace them with hospitals and freeways and stadiums, right? We can't talk about climate without talking about the existential realities that communities of color, especially Black and brown Oregonians, have faced, right? You can see this image on the left is what it looked like, what the Albina neighborhood looked like around the 1950s. And then this image on the right is what it looked like in the 70s. You can just see between the stadium, that's Memorial Coliseum, that gray box on the bottom on the right. You can just see that this neighborhood was destroyed. It was taken, it was dismantled, and it was replaced. That has significant consequences for how we talk about housing afterwards. This is what the area around the Rose Quarter looks like today. And just to scale, here's an image of inner Southeast Portland. You know, this is Ladd's Addition. Ladd's Addition did not get torn out for a freeway. Southeast Portland was able to fight off a freeway on Southeast Clinton, but Albina was not, right? And, you know, it's not a surprise. This is what happened in every community across the state of Oregon. This is a photo of Ta-Nehisi Coates, who has, you know, been leading the charge in the last decade to really bring back the conversation of reparations. And I think that the conversation of reparations is talking, you know, he talks so much about how much wealth was tied up in Black land ownership and plundering that came from urban renewal, right? So this image on the right here is a photo of what North Williams used to look like in the 60s and 70s. And this building does no longer exist today and has been torn out for a hospital expansion that never happened. So it's an empty lot to this day. So we have to just acknowledge that that is the context of what's happened in this neighborhood. So when ODOT comes talking about, oh, well, we're going to reconnect the neighborhood by literally expanding the original trespass, the cardinal sin of 20th century urban planning in this neighborhood, Well, we should ask some questions because it sounds like they're playing fast and loose with what these definitions of restorative justice look like. Just real quick for folks that aren't super involved with transportation planning, it's just worth noting, even if you love your cars and you like driving, freeway expansions are terrible. There isn't a single freeway expansion anywhere in North America that has solved traffic congestion by expanding a freeway. And I'm going to say that one more time. Not a single freeway expansion anywhere in North America that has solved traffic congestion by widening a freeway. Los Angeles spent $1.7 billion widening a bottleneck only to find congestion get worse. It's super counterintuitive, but by widening freeways, you're merely encouraging more people to drive. And the more that you encourage more people to drive, it just means that more people are stuck in that traffic jam with you, right? And the inherent geometry of a single person in a large automobile moving around a dense city, there's just no space around it without changing the incentives for people to drive less. 40%, we mentioned 40% of Oregon's carbon emissions. I'm really, really proud of the youth at Sunrise PDX. If you're not involved with your local Sunrise chapter, wherever you are across the country, I hope you'll join. Sunrise has been pushing for this Green New Deal and just bringing youth up to testify. For all of you on this call that are under the age of 25, I can't overemphasize, call into every single meeting. You know, the video we just watched was talk about climate in every one of your classes. Yeah, do that. And also just shout at your elected officials. How dare you? I have 8.5 years. I'm going to be, what, 31 years old. Name what age you will be at 2030 and be like, if you don't solve this by this age, my life is pretty much dealing with cataclysmic doom. How dare you? And make sure that it's on television and make sure you shame them and make sure it's happening in public spaces and that you can stare them in the eyes, because that is the kind of stuff that we need. The climate urgency is real. The emergency requires you to stare down these adults and really hold them to a reckoning of what they are doing to your future. Oh, and by the way, this freeway is in the backyard of Harriet Tubman Middle School, which is a historic, important building in North Portland that already has some of the worst air pollution in the state because of this freeway that's in their backyard. Literally, Portland State University put out a research report saying students probably shouldn't even have outdoor recess, that the air pollution is so bad. And by the way, I mentioned previously a little bit about my work on doing traffic safety stuff. ODOT owns TV Highway in Washington County. It has 40% of all traffic fatalities in all of Washington County are on this one street that ODOT owns. ODOT never fixes that. There's multiple fatalities, even just in the last couple months, but they have $800 million to widen the Rose Quarter Freeway expansion. So it's just a really wild question of, okay, well, what are your priorities? Why are you focusing on freeway expansion as opposed to literally all of these other things that if you're taking an intersectional approach to transportation justice, you acknowledge you have to reduce carbon emissions, but the best way to do it is to bring in folks that are really sad and hurt personally by traffic violence, by folks that really understand how traffic violence is disproportionately given to low income and communities of color, and have all of those voices standing in coalition, right? I always bring up this slide. I just find it really funny for those that even remember a couple of years ago when we still had this fascist that was just lying in office. But this image here of like, if you read the actual story, it says actually there was quite a bit of coordination going on with Russia, but the headline didn't say so much. And similarly, the story that the Columbian wrote on the Rose Quarter, it actually not noted that ODOT was not doing anything meaningful about the bottleneck, but the headline kind of suggested. So we're kind of in this interesting spot where we have to really find a way to control the narrative, and that requires strategic thinking, that requires communications, that requires community organizing, because the powerful people know and resources know how to line up getting positive press coverage. But you have the people, you have the resources, and you have the urgency to fix this. Progress in the 21st century should be measured less by the new infrastructure you build than by the damaging infrastructure you retire. And I think that that applies to white supremacy. I think that applies to the patriarchy. I think that applies to the worst vestiges of capitalism. And I think it speaks of prisons, pipelines, all of that sort of stuff. All of the beautiful things that I hope all of you get the chance to build in your lifetimes will also require retiring the bad stuff. And it's a different politic at times about how do you retire the bad stuff versus build the new stuff. Everyone loves to talk about building new wind turbines and solar panels, but there's a different politic involved about closing down the coal plants, right? And I use the term freeway industrial complex in honor of Angela Davis, who coined the term specifically referencing a prison industrial complex. There's a bipartisan coalition of trade sector lobbyists and asphalt lobbyists and automobiles and oil, all of these people, and ex-urban sprawl. And you have to build your own political relationships and some of that's working with elected officials, some of that's working with nonprofits, some of that's just working with your classmates and building those relationships that can take on the freeway industrial complex that is perpetuating the gray old deal. I'll also just say that like you have to build those relationships because ODOT is very comfortable and the gray old deal is very comfortable just making stuff up, right? I don't have time in this call to go into it, but in our fight against the Rose Quarter freeway expansion, we've caught ODOT manipulating traffic data multiple times, lying to the community about the impacts on air pollution, lying to the community about how large the footprint of this project is going to be, lying to the public about the costs, hiding crucial maps that show exactly where this thing is going to be built. That took a lot of different skills. I bring that up to say that like, whether you're a caffeinated overtalker like I am, or whether you're a data geek that wants to like, you know, look through a bunch of old plans and maps, it takes all kinds, and there's roles for everybody in the climate emergency and finding your way of getting involved. And we had a lot of, I'm not very good at math. We got a lot of math dorks that went in and ran through all of ODOT's traffic projections. And it requires doing a bunch of homework and learning of these. I consider myself very politically involved, and it took a very knowledgeable about transportation. There's this agency that oversees ODOT that meets around the state once a month, different corner. This is the agency that should be providing the oversight, but they're not doing it. So you have to find them and hold them accountable to it. So the agency, they're not used to having television cameras come and put young people in their faces and say, how dare you ruin my climate future? You have to do that work to destroy the gray old deal. And I think that's really what I'm trying to get away with on this message is, you know, the version of retiring the bad stuff is a huge part of this. And you know what, like, I really like riding the bus. I really like biking, but if I drive once or twice, that's actually fine in the grand scheme of if you were retiring the systemic infrastructure, right? Like I put in this image here of a hamburger. I love hamburgers. I'm trying to eat more vegetarian. I'm getting better. I'm getting kind of good at grilling tofu, but I could eat hamburgers every day if I also managed to pass a bill that changed agricultural policy that created a world in which people ate a lot less meat and the meat that they ate produced a lot less carbon. Now, granted, I'm a lot more likely to be an effective carbon advocate for vegetarian options if I'm like, yeah, I actually really like tofu, right? Like the practice of doing the personal is really valuable for understanding the structural, but I think that like one needs to understand the value of how the top down and bottom up organizing kind of work together. So as, you know, to wrap this sort of stuff up, we just sued. We just filed a lawsuit against the Oregon Department of Transportation this Monday. We're really excited about it. We're writing letters to Secretary Pete Buttigieg. We've been getting a lot of attention about other freeway expansions that are happening across the country. And I personally, as a young white man who's operating with abundance of privileges of education and comfort, that it's my job to retire all of this racist, classist, awful bullshit, apologies for saying that word, so that the 21st century can grow in its place, right? And there's this whole vision group, the Albina Vision Trust, that's focusing on, well, what does restorative justice look like for what was originally the largest Black neighborhood in the state of Oregon? How do we reclaim? How do we heal? And I am not I have plenty of ideas of what that neighborhood could look like, but it's not up to me. It's kind of up to me to figure out how to retire the bad stuff so that Albina Vision has a space to plant the roots and thrive. So I just want to ask all of you, like, as you move forward, the gray old deal you are retiring, again, you can go get a job working for a consulting firm. You can go get a job in the private sector. And if you actually spend that time trying to like challenge the patriarchy or challenge systemic racism, that's actually really good too, right? And it's actually helpful towards building this Green New Deal. But just understanding that whatever sector of line of work that you are in, whatever community relationships you build, thinking about the intersectional nature of that work across the board is crucial, and it's essential for getting us there. So my final plug is if you are in the Portland area, this Friday, we're having a rally to celebrate our lawsuit. I would love for any and all of you to be there. NoMoreFreewaysPDX.com, there's more information. It takes all kinds, and I'm really grateful for everyone's time, and congratulations on finishing your senior year of college.
Thank you, Aaron. I am also trying to eat more Impossible burgers. And boy, I haven't seen a picture of Angela Davis for a long time. And I forget how big her hair was. Unfortunately, she's about the same age as I am. Our next speaker is Victoria Paykar. And Victoria, the stage is yours.
I'm just going to share my screen really quickly. All right, I think that should work. Can you see that okay, Don?
I can.
Awesome, great. Well, hi everyone, good evening, or whenever you see this, hello. My name is Victoria Paykar and I work at Climate Solutions and I'm the Oregon Transportation Policy Manager there. And tonight I wanted to talk about working in the intersection of transportation, climate change, and justice. I'm going to be touching along a lot of the same things that Erin was highlighting. And I think, you know, kind of what Erin left off with of just like being really intersectional in the work, no matter what it is that you're doing, and striving for justice is ultimately the key of how we can combat climate change and really build a society that works for all people. So with that, I'll get started. And so I want to touch quickly on like the work that I do and also like how I got involved as well. This picture is probably the other kind of transportation related greenhouse gas emissions picture and a companion piece to Erin's picture. So this is the greenhouse gas emissions by economic sector as a nationwide, so in the whole US. And you can see here that transportation comprises about 28% of the US's greenhouse gas emissions. And so at Climate Solutions, we're a nonprofit here in the Pacific Northwest in Oregon and Washington state. And what we do is we try to pass policies to accelerate clean energy solutions in the face of the climate crisis. So primarily my work is I work on cleaning up the transportation sector in Oregon with this racial equity and justice lens. And so usually when I tell people that I'm working like in the clean transportation space and like tying that in with greenhouse gas emissions, a lot of people are like, oh, great. So you work with like electric vehicles and other things like that. And yes, like that's part of my work. But it's also not like the end all be all to all the solutions that we need to work towards in order to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions in the transportation sector, or really to solve climate change. And I think that touches back on like Erin's piece of just like really like what are those systemic issues that we have, and like really go deeper into what the root of all these problems are. And so a lot of that you'll find in all these forms like injustices that exist today. And I'll be talking about that in the next slide. But quickly to go over kind of the work that I do. So when I talk about clean transportation, there's all these different pieces. So the first one is like that transitioning off fossil fuel-based transportation. So thinking about how we can move away from fossil fuel as a fuel and move towards electricity for the transportation sector. And another piece is reducing vehicle miles traveled. So I feel like those two are like companion pieces. So how are we reducing vehicle miles traveled, or VMT, and then like electrifying everything else. So with vehicle miles traveled, there's a lot of pieces in that as well. So thinking about how do we expand public transit infrastructure, how do we expand e-mobility options? So like shared scooters, shared bikes, car sharing, and then also increasing kind of equitable transit-oriented development. So how are we building these livable, walkable cities that everyone can benefit from and increase the quality of life in that way? And I think another piece of that is also securing kind of this anti-displacement and tenant protection policies as well. So we're not, causing gentrification through these like sustainable kind of improvements. And then another piece that I wanted to touch on was implementing transportation justice. So currently, Erin touched upon this, just like the history of transportation, and I'll go into it in a little bit as well. But just knowing that transportation system wasn't created equally for everyone. And so when we're thinking about making changes to transportation, we have to, again, think about the structures of transportation and how to really make it affordable, accessible, efficient, and safe for everyone. And then also there's this piece on like reducing air pollution. So coming from it from kind of this public health and environmental justice lens as well, where we're focusing primarily on like disproportionately burdened Black, Indigenous, people of color communities and low income communities that are disproportionately burdened by air pollution due to kind of this inner city highway construction, redlining, et cetera, that I'll touch upon in a second. And the last piece is kind of this enhancing workforce development opportunities. So this is working with kind of labor partners to apply our just transition framework to achieve these fair labor practices and kind of create quality jobs in the process. So this next slide is where I wanted to like tie in all these pieces together. So for my transportation work, you know, I'm always thinking about it in an environmental justice frame, and in that in turn is also in a climate justice frame as well. So as I mentioned before, transportation affects our day-to-day lives, and it's not benefiting everyone. And transportation, you know, isn't just from getting from point A to point B, but it's also about like the access, and that's ultimately what I'm trying to improve while reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And the reality is that our transportation system doesn't work for everyone, especially when we think of people who don't use a car to get around to access, you know, the grocery store, school, jobs, or even medical appointments. So when we say, for example, we need to reduce vehicle miles traveled while not providing appropriate transportation options or like housing options, we're negatively impacting vulnerable communities who already have a hard time accessing inequitable transportation options. So I think that we always have to be thinking holistically, and transportation is a really is one of those sectors, I think, that really just incorporates all types of and requires all types of thinking, because it's really a multifaceted issue and requires multifaceted solutions in that regard as well. And so for the next couple of minutes, I just want to talk about why it's so important to come to climate change work with a holistic and intersectional lens of justice. And so the question that I generally pose to people is that, you know, if you think that I'm trying to work to solve climate change in a silo so that this world can continue the way it is with gross inequalities and injustices being felt by the majority of humankind, that's wrong, you know. And so while I work in the transportation sector, I want to make sure that policies I'm pushing for are addressing historic injustices that the transportation sector created, but also other injustices that exist in our system and can be addressed by completely reimagining our transportation sector. And so this is something, again, that I'll touch upon at the end of my presentation, but again, reiterating too, on Erin's point as well, of just like this intersectionality, again, because problems are not single-sided and need that holistic lens. And so for transportation, I wanted to point you to kind of the structural inequities that exist in transportation. And so here are listed on this slide. You can, you know, see kind of this inner city highway construction, urban renewal, racially sided eminent domain, redlining, et cetera. There's a lot of great information out there, lots of books, lots of articles. Definitely recommend you just like Google searching if you aren't familiar with any of these topics. And if you're not familiar, I mean, again, it's just something that our education system doesn't teach us. And it's something that we need to be very aware of if we're trying to really change systemic issues. And so how this intersects too with transportation is that, a lot of these racist policies, transportation policies and planning policies and decisions ultimately restricted and forced communities of color and low-income communities to move into high concentrated, high traffic areas next to highways, ports, railroads, industrial facilities. And so this has led to a very big environmental justice problem where disproportionately communities of color and low-income communities face a higher risk of breathing in some of the most toxic air in the country. And then they're like consequently suffering from a disproportionate level of respiratory and cardiovascular illnesses, including in today's pandemic, higher infection and death rates from COVID-19. So this is all connected, and this is all kind of classic example of environmental racism and all these pieces that we're thinking about, like just in transportation, right? And so winding down now, I just wanted to, share with you kind of transportation with a justice lens. So just, understanding that if we continue upholding the status quo, we won't achieve justice. And there was this last year, Ibram X. Kendi released, How to Be an Anti-Racist, which was a great book. Definitely recommend it to folks if you haven't read it, or even just like listening to a YouTube video interview or a podcast with Ibram X. Kendi. And one of the main takeaways that I love from his book is just that, if you're not actively promoting anti-racist policies, you're promoting racist policies. And that's because of our society and what the status quo is and who it benefits. And ultimately thinking about white supremacy and patriarchy, and capitalism, we're continuing the status quo that ultimately is creating these inequities and these market failures, which is climate change in this scenario. So one of the kind of solutions that I've been working with and really have loved seeing in communities really across the world is thinking about how to rebuild the transportation system and solutions to climate change in a way that creates solutions centered around the well-being of people and the sustainability of the planet. By involving people in the design and the processes of the transportation work, of whatever it is, of housing, and just other kind of justice issues or abolition kind of projects. So this is an example from participatorybudgeting.org, but I wanted to include this here because it's a great image of what I'm just trying to talk about. So it's like having the community come together. So first, paying community members for their time and expertise to come to the table and say what their needs are and so it's what do you need to be successful, or what do you need for your transportation needs that you aren't getting right now? How can we design this together? So this is thinking about at the local level, how does a city or region work with the community to really build solutions that work for everyone in the community. And so together, it's we can work to build people-centered, community-designed sustainability solutions. And so definitely wanted to highlight that as kind of a solution that I see us moving forward from how do we recreate this? And it's not just by putting bandages on the system that is already broken, but it's really about recreating this. And I think a lot of that does come from this community-centered approach. So I'll leave then this conversation with a couple pieces of advice that I wish I received when I was a college student or a high school student as well, thinking about climate change. So the first one is don't do it alone. The problems can't rest on your shoulders. This is something that I have to remind myself even to this day, every day. Working on justice issues in general, including climate justice, is not something new to our generation, and climate change is not an exception to this. And so one thing I've learned from justice movements is that we need to come together to fight for what's right. So on top of avoiding existential despair, being in a group dedicated to solve justice issues, whether at the local level or even national or international level, allows us to like talk about these problems that we may be facing. And it also allows us to use and identify our unique skills on how we can make a difference. And the second piece is just like, you know, again, reiterating this, like make the fight for climate change intersectional. And I love this like tweet by Cori Bush, where she says, you know, environmental justice is housing justice, health justice, climate justice, indigenous justice, racial justice. And I would say vice versa. You know, you could take any justice issue and say like housing justice is environmental issues because of the intersection that exists. So going back to Erin's point, it doesn't matter what career you end up choosing, you can always bring back like this climate justice perspective in your work. So that's, I think, something key to take away. And then the last thing that I just want to end with is this analysis. And it's just like, I don't want to get too deep in the weeds here because I could talk about this for many hours, but I just want to say like we need to really be analytical on like who has the power and who benefits from the status quo. And I think that this is very true with climate change. And I wanted to share this graph that Chris published last year. And it's kind of just showing the CO2 emissions over the years. And so in 2020, our CO2 emissions went down 7%. That's it. So in the pandemic, when everyone almost was stuck at home, and we had like, this is the lowest we have ever gone, like in a year. And we're talking about needing to go to like almost zero to avoid like climate disaster. So I just want to, you know, I want to show this slide that ultimately it's, you know, individual actions are important, but at the end of the day, it's individual actions, and I would say even more importantly is understanding like who has created kind of these rules so that they could continue thriving on exploitation and destruction. And so, you know, I was going to say like there are just like these rules that those with the most power have set so that they can continue reaping the benefits of the world pretty much at the literal expense of everyone and everything on this planet. So I think that when we're thinking about where to get the most bang for the buck on climate change, it's addressing these structural issues, understanding who has the power and who continues to benefit, and then making, you know, trying to get decisions changed based on those types of kind of questions and analyses. So I'll end it there, and thanks so much for listening.
Thank you, V. One of the things I was hoping to accomplish is to make people who are watching this, our viewers, understand that climate change isn't about electric cars alone. It's not about cutting back on your driving alone. There is an intersection with social justice, and the two of you have done wonderful. And now we have yet a third speaker, James. It is your turn.
All right, well, thank you all for being here and viewing this. Let me go ahead and get my slides up real quick. Just a moment. Not sure if you're seeing those. It's gonna take me twice, doing this twice, of course. The presenter mode isn't working. Okay, here we go. Let me know when you do see, I apologize, this is,
we're all used to Zoom being a little slow sometimes, or technological challenges.
It's just not showing the full screen mode. It's wanting to go to the one that is not full screen. Here we go.
There we go.
All right, now you should be seeing my presentation. I apologize for that. And yeah, I am here to share a story of really part of the solution, not the entire solution, but hopefully something to inspire people and students of how change can be made, and to address elements of what Dee and Aaron have said, kind of how to shift power, how to develop new models and resources to address environmental justice, to put resources in the hands of communities that have been vulnerable and marginalized in the past, and to really reshape the future of climate action. And so I'm here, my name is James Valdez, and I use he, him pronouns, and I work for the City of Portland's Bureau of Planning and Sustainability on a program called the Portland Clean Energy Community Benefits Fund. We often abbreviate this to Portland Clean Energy Fund, or PCEF, so you'll hear me using that acronym. I also, I guess, want to address the reality that both Vi and Aaron have brought up of the way that city planning and land use has a history of racism and exclusion and appropriation of land and resources from communities of color. And it's something that we are acutely aware of within the Bureau. And some of my colleagues actually did what I think is a very good report that I want to share with you all in the chat. Maybe this will work, because I don't expect you to look at this now because it'll be distracting. But this is some real tangible ways that the history of Portland's racist policies have impacted people negatively. And it gets into both property ownership and transportation, and is something that's important for the city to acknowledge. And part of why I feel very grateful to be a part of this new chapter of the Bureau of Planning and Sustainability, and moving towards solutions to more equitably and justly distribute resources and plan our future, both in the climate and also in land use and how we live in our city. And so, speaking to kind of the details of the Portland Clean Energy Fund, it really is a story of community and people getting together and identifying needs and identifying solutions in new ways that, frankly, was not possible even a few years ago, and where even the organizers were told this is impossible, or you can't do this. And so what happened, really, the story of the Portland Clean Energy Fund, is communities of color identifying that there needs to be a new model by which to develop projects, to employ people, to envision new community opportunities that wasn't rooted in the past incentives or limitations of clean energy programs or projects around urban infrastructure and green infrastructure, but needed a new framework for that. And so the vehicle or vessel for that was a ballot initiative that took, hundreds of people, thousands and thousands of volunteers, and tens of thousands of voters to be successful. And it was a multi-year process that started really kind of around 2015, 2016, to then get on the November 2018 ballot. And so the Portland Clean Energy Fund initiative was just a huge upswelling of community organizing and going to parts of Portland, especially in East Portland, that have historically been left out of a lot of kind of activism and conversations around climate policy or opportunities. And was, just to name it, East Portland was annexed into the city of Portland in the 80s and 90s, and was promised a lot of infrastructure improvements, was promised a lot of livability improvements that just were not delivered. And so one of the many elements of Portland Clean Energy Fund is to ensure that there is a lens of distributing the benefits of new projects throughout the city, and particularly in places that have been underinvested in the past. But really, the story was that it was amazingly successful. The Portland Clean Energy Initiative passed by a 2-to-1 margin in November of 2018. Over 65% of the vote of Portland voters voted for it. And it is a huge success that we're now implementing. And so the City of Portland Bureau of Planning and Sustainability is tasked with launching the program. And I just feel just incredibly grateful to have been working on this project for the last year and a half or so. And just last week, we made our first allocation of funding of $8.6 million from the fund. So I'll talk a little bit more about that in a little bit, because I know we don't have that much time. But what the fund is and what the ballot initiative created is a revenue source, a grant funding opportunity that is intended to address climate action and make investments in the community, but through a lens and through a process that really centers social and racial justice. And it does so by implementing a 1% gross receipts fee, or kind of gross receipts tax on the largest corporations that do business in Portland. And so these are businesses that do over $1 billion of sales nationally and over $500,000 of sales within the city. And then the ballot initiative created some exemptions for necessary things like utilities, groceries, medicine, to ensure that it wasn't regressive in nature. And in total, it will be generating between $40 to $60 million per year on an ongoing basis. And it really was a landmark in that this is the first kind of ballot initiative in the whole country that was really led by and intended to benefit communities of color in Portland, or communities of color anywhere. But Portland was the first to do it in this manner. And so I wanted to quickly touch on kind of how this fits with our climate action goals, because Portland, the overall story of Portland's climate action has a long history and is generally positive in the sense that we've been making steady declines in carbon emissions overall from our 1990 kind of benchmark. But the reality is that we need to go so much deeper and so much faster than this chart shows our historic progress, that we need to accelerate all our investments in community to really meet climate goals. Also, a lot of people have been left out of the past climate action that Portland has enacted. And the state of Oregon, for instance, has dedicated billions of dollars for renewable energy tax credits for businesses and residents, but very few of those benefits were able to go to low-income Oregonians or people of color. And so when we look at the future of both the rate of change that we need to have and also the distribution of that benefit, we really have to change how the system works. And this is 2018 numbers, but you can see that kind of the top 3 sources of emissions within Portland and Multnomah County are electricity, which is primarily use in homes and businesses, gasoline, which is the transportation elements that you've just heard about, and natural gas, which is, or fracked fossil gas, which is being used to heat a lot of our homes and then also has use in industrial processes. So the Portland Clean Energy Fund distributes money through a grant process that is led by really nonprofit organizations coming and putting proposals in front of a committee and staff to articulate their needs to do projects in the community. So then those grant proposals are evaluated by a panel of scoring that includes both staff, committee members, and also subject matter experts. And then the PSEP committee, which is composed of 9 community members with a variety of expertise in different areas and that are broadly representative from a race and ethnicity and gender perspective of the city of Portland. They're the ones who make funding recommendations to City Council of what should be funded and what the values are of what's important in each funding round. And they also help create the whole structure for Portland Clean Energy Fund and each funding round that we do. And it's just really important to recognize that this is a community-led process that is very different than many of the other ways that that Portland has historically distributed money or that grant programs work in the public sector. And there's kind of 4 major areas of funding the Portland Clean Energy Fund is intended to fund. The largest is clean energy programs. And so these are improvements in the places where people live, work, worship, learn, and play. And that includes a whole range of improvements that could be made to reduce energy use or to generate power from renewables like solar, but to really improve the buildings in and around Portland and the way that we use them. Then there's a recognition that there needs to be new job training opportunities, especially for people of color, for women, for people with disabilities that have been kind of locked out either systemically or due to racist policies from opportunities in the workforce, that we need to create new pathways for job training, apprenticeship, and really educational opportunities to be a part of the clean energy economy. So 20 to 25% of the fund is allocated to contractor training and supporting workforce development. There's also recognition that the natural areas in and around our city help sequester carbon. So things like regenerative agriculture or doing local food distribution in different ways, or planting street trees or bioswales or rooftop gardening. These things all can help sequester carbon and have an infrastructure benefit of the urban green spaces around us. And so 10 to 15% is dedicated to that. And then there's a recognition that there's a lot of solutions out there in the community that don't fit nicely into those other buckets. So we have a 5% allocation for innovation. I'm not going to go through all of these slides in great detail, but I just wanted to note that one of the first things that the committee came up with community input was really a set of guiding principles of values that would then be leaned upon when making decisions about the fund. And so those 4 guiding principles are that the fund should be focused on climate action with multiple benefits. We should look at not just carbon savings, but also what are the cost savings for people and what are the kind of job creation opportunities for people. That it be justice driven, that in particular, that we center our work on meeting the needs of Black, Indigenous, people of color within the city of Portland, both in terms of who's designing projects and who's benefiting, that be community powered, that we really trust the relationships and the history and knowledge that people are bringing into the program, and that be accountable, that we're transparent in how we make decisions, that we make kind of information available in all steps of our process. And so I feel like I'm running a little low on time, but I just wanted to kind of go through a few of the steps of public process, because I think it's something we've talked to a little bit earlier from Bea and Aaron of who's involved really matters, and the ways in which you gather input really matter. And so we're continually learning and we'll continue to improve, but we were really proud of at least this initial step of getting a lot of input into our guiding principles, reshaping those based on the input we received, then also making all the scoring criteria of the grant process available for public comment so that people could see how they would be, how their proposals would be weighed, or kind of what pieces were important to the grant committee. And so then we received feedback in that process that there were barriers, especially for organizations representing people of color and for smaller organizations. So we then reshaped the whole grant process based on that. Then we also provided application support grants focused on providing $5,000 increments of funding for small organizations that were led by Black and Indigenous people, or that served Black and Indigenous people, to ensure that we were reducing additional barriers of capacity for people to be able to apply. And in this first round, we received 140 applications and spent a ton of time doing a review and evaluation, and had a follow-up kind of feedback round. And then we were really happy last Thursday, I'm sorry, to announce that we had a portfolio of grantees that was approved by City Council, representing 45 different grant applications. 86 of those are going to organizations that directly represent the priority populations of women, low income, communities of color that they intend to serve. And 38% of those funds are going to organizations that are small organizations that have less than 6 full-time employees. So I won't go into the full kind of breakdown there, but another big piece is that we provided $2.5 million of that funding for planning grants, recognizing that a lot of organizations are not quite ready yet to put forward their project for climate action, but need a little bit more time and community engagement or technical analysis to really do that work and come forward in a future round with an application. And so this is kind of part of building the capacity of organizations to do future work, to see themselves as part of climate action. And so this is where we're at kind of now, is we're doing the onboarding of grantees. We're looking to the next round, which is significantly larger. It's $60 million that we'll be giving out in grants later this year, kind of in the late summer, early fall, continuing to identify our own blind spots of organizations or types of applicants that did not apply, who we need to reach out to, and building the capacity, especially of smaller BIPOC-centered organizations, to be able to see themselves in climate work and to develop project ideas. There's also some critical elements of implementing workforce standards and tracking who benefits from the labor. So also wanted to highlight another kind of state level campaign that a lot of the organizations that dedicated time to passing Portland Clean Energy Fund are now involved in, which is called the Oregon Clean Energy Opportunity Campaign. There's a link there, but this campaign is now focused on state level action to decarbonize the electric sector, to create an equitable opportunity for rate discounts or energy rates to reflect an income sensitivity, so that people who have less ability to pay aren't as burdened with high energy bills, and also to make statewide more improvements in people's homes. So I did want to leave some time for questions and answers. I didn't have like a nice wrap up kind of slide, but I did want to provide a few reflections based on both what V and Aaron have already said, but also some of my own experience. I think a theme that I've seen in my life is that it's more than just individual behavior change. It really is about creating system change, identifying those levers of opportunity. And the successful movements, you know, whether it's for racial justice or economic justice or environmental justice, have been the ones that have been able to see the places in the system that need to change, not just changing individual people's behavior. And so I encourage you all to seek out those roles where you can put your weight, however big or small that lever is, to make those systemic changes, and to identify opportunities, not just the problems, because I feel like a lot of times in the environmental space, we focus on the problem without looking to what multitude of solutions might be there, or organizations operate from a scarcity mentality that capitalism is very good at putting us and indoctrinating us into a scarcity mentality when there's a lot of resources out there. And so I guess, yeah, try to focus on opportunities, and then also understand people's needs, understand the needs of your community. In the context of Portland Clean Energy Fund, you know, we're really encouraging people to see that everything that they're doing has a potential linkage to climate action. Things that are about food systems, or even a lot of the pandemic mutual aid relief, has a lot of those solutions have elements of climate action that we can learn from and continue to evolve on and iterate on. So I would encourage you to volunteer, to find communities that you feel connected with, and to then articulate the needs of those communities and learn to give voice both to yourself and to other people to make that systemic change. So yeah, I know there's a lot more to explore, but I hope that this has been helpful and inspirational. And yeah, we'll open up for questions.
Thank you, James.
Go ahead and stop sharing.
We do have a couple minutes for questions, and Liandra is going to look at the chat perhaps and see what we have there. But Liandra and I had a goal for this webinar, which was essentially to help people know that there is an important interaction between climate justice, social justice, and climate change. And it's an interaction that many in our audience don't see. And the three of you have done a fantastic job, a real wonderful job at helping our audience see that connection and helping me even see that connection. So without going on too much, we're going to take a couple minutes to answer a couple questions. I see that Aaron has been busy answering some of the questions individually. Appreciate that, Aaron. But I think there's a couple questions in there that I would like to have all of you address if possible. And Liandra, pick one.
Okay. I suppose since we have the upvoting, I'll start from the top. So here is one for everyone. So how do you, as activists, keep your energy and focus and hopes up, and ideally keep your sanity?
Go ahead and unmute, and whoever starts, that would be fine.
I have a question.
I already answered, so I'm going to make our other panelists at least start.
Oh, sorry, James, did you want to go first? Or?
No, you go, V. I'm still formulating my answer.
Yeah. That's a really excellent question, because it's something that, as I mentioned, like I have to just do every day and remind myself every day. I think inherently, I'm like thinking, I thought I was an optimistic person, but everything that comes out of my mouth is so pessimistic. And I'm like, nah, it's actually just like me being a realist. But I would say that inherently as activists, you are an optimistic person, because if you didn't think this would be possible, you wouldn't be trying to do it. So that's probably just like something that I just remind myself every day, like, no, I'm trying to work on this. And then how I get there without just like falling in existential dread, which does happen every, now and again. I would say that for me, it's just like starting small. So I think like, I wanted to show this slide that like pretty much like talked about like all like the justice issues and stuff. And I was like, no, like I can't take myself there. I can't take you all there, because it just really like compounds on itself. And you're like, wow, there's just so much issues that we have to deal with. Like, where do we start? And I think like that's the answer. It's just like, we have to start small. So it's like in your community, like, where do you see like the biggest need? And where do you see like the biggest opportunity for change? And again, like at that systems level, and where are we thinking about like, there's unequal balance of power. How can we get more power back into the hands of community to actually get like to achieve community needs? And so that might show up in many different ways. Again, but it all ties, ultimately it will most likely tie into, what you're most passionate about and what you're interested in achieving. So yeah, even if you're working on like housing, housing rights or prison abolition or whatever it is, there's just like, it all ties in, and ultimately will, work towards achieving like climate justice, I think, in a way. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, and I mean, it's interesting because now, I work for an institution, the city of Portland, but I still do consider myself an activist. There's a funny, there's a term I heard that I like, it's called a bureaucrativist instead of being just a bureaucrat. And yeah, my previous work was in the advocacy space, and I feel like I will continue to push for the things and changes that I'm hearing in the community that are needed, even as somebody who's a public servant, and trying not to get too, wrapped up into the institution itself. And so I think that's important, as whether some of the audience here is going into academia or into different industries, or even, the nonprofit sector itself can be kind of limiting and insular in some ways too. And I've worked for many nonprofits over the years too. So it's about finding where you can kind of manifest the kind of things you're passionate about But look for those small wins, as we said, like look for small actions and build a community of people who are willing to fight with you, like fight with you as in, you know, be behind you and together in community with you. Though also people that challenge you are important too. And yeah, I think it's just, you have to be optimistic in this space to be able to see that capacity for change and growth. So maybe that is something that, you know, unites everybody here on the panel. But yeah, those are some of my pieces of advice.
Go for it, sorry.
I want to add that I have been, as an academic, teaching about environmental economics, about climate change for more than 30 years now. And it's like a roller coaster. There are some down times when you just don't see any progress, and nothing, the needle seems to be stuck in a particular place. But then there are times like this opportunity for this webinar, you feel like that you're creating community and people are able to hear, and activism picks up, and things change. Sometimes it's a little slow, but the needle does move. Aaron, you wanted to add?
I already wrote my comments, so I'll be brief. But you know, what really tugged at my heartstrings reading that question was just, you know, keeping up your sanity. And as I mentioned in the comments, like, I don't understand how anyone could look at the math and not have the existential dread of what we're up against at this moment. But you know, the work that you're doing in building these community relations, you know, it's hokey at times, but like a lot of the work I do with Sunrise and like all of these folks that are closer to the age of the folks that are on this call than to my age. But you know, having events together and being able to share in your climate grief and being able to just sort of like process what you thought your future was going to look like, but what it is going to look like instead. Those are really difficult and brave and honest conversations and being vulnerable with each other. But if you don't have that outlet, you know, you'll go nuts. Like you have to be able to build those spaces for that emotional release. And I'm going to put a link in the chat to a book. It's written by, the book's called All We Can Save. And it's a collection of like climate feminist leaders, just all these different women that have just brought a bunch of perspectives of, you know, we're not being, you know, how do you strike that balance of knowing the world is doomed, but also not becoming a doomer? Because you have to have this tactical optimism, right? Like optimism is a tool in of itself. And that's not to say that it's blind faith that everything's going to be fine, as much as that like building the community resiliency. I mean, I think all of us in the last year have had to really reflect on what resiliency looks like, right? And resiliency from wildfires and everything else. So,
and that's what climate leadership is.
Yes, absolutely.
Is maintaining that sense of optimism. Liandra, do we have another question? I don't want to keep people too long. I know it's an evening event. Do we have maybe a question more?
Oh, there's so many good questions in here.
Shoot.
All right, so I think a lot of you have mentioned, you know, getting involved in your local community. Here's one. So what are specific people or organizations you could point us to if we want to volunteer or get involved?
Well, I guess I would encourage people to get involved in the Oregon Clean Energy Opportunity Campaign. That's one active element. The legislative session is going on right now. And so there's a lot of need for amplifying voices. And that campaign is led, again, by a lot of the communities of color that helped pass Portland Clean Energy Fund, including organizations like Apano, Verde, Opal Environmental Justice, the Oregon Just Transition Alliance. I know I am missing a whole lot, but yeah, so that would be one pathway of organizations that are active in climate work right now that are focused on communities of color and the climate justice element. On the transportation side, I have to admit, I'm not as well versed in the players, but that's why we have V and Aaron.
I want to mention No More Freeways. Just before Aaron did.
I mean, I was gonna mention V's group and a bunch of others. You know, I talked about transportation being intersectional, and you know, there's some people maybe on this call that want to go become urban planners or you know, really technical focused, whatever. And some people really love bikes, some people love transit, some people like. There's so many different angles that you can take. You know, I mean, it's been the theme of this call today, right? But like, for instance, there's efforts right now of restricting the amount of cops that are on TriMet's buses and light rail. And maybe for you, maybe for some of us, that doesn't seem like a climate justice issue, but when you look at who's actually riding transit, who needs to be riding transit into the future, and whether or not people feel safe and comfortable being on transit, increasingly that does actually look like a climate justice issue. Because what is the point of over-policing these spaces if our most vulnerable residents that need transit the most feel as though transit is not a viable option for them, right? If our undocumented neighbors don't feel comfortable riding a bus because they're afraid they're going to get deported if the cop looks at them the wrong way, well, then they're going to be driving. And, you know, and I would also say if that's the reason you care about this, then like you should really go back and reflect honestly about like the humanity of our neighbors that maybe don't have the paperwork or maybe you're unhoused, right? Like there's a really crucial necessity of understanding that, you know, this work applies in different directions. So I'm rambling, but in the Portland area, Oregon Walks is an organization that I care deeply about, the Street Trust, the Community Cycling Center, Opal Environmental Justice Oregon, especially for environmental justice stuff, I would say. And yes, our rally on Friday at No More Freeways.
Yeah, I don't have much more to add. All those organizations are amazing. I would say too, for folks who aren't in the Portland area, just quickly wanted to add, like I'm more on like the politics and policy leaning side of things. So again, just like talking about how all these issues are intersectional and thinking about like that humanity aspect and like injustice somewhere is, you know, yeah. I forgot that the Martin Luther King quote, sorry. But anyways, just like, you know, we can't stand for injustice at the end of the day that's in one place and then be like, oh, it's okay, it's not over here. So I would say like definitely getting involved on the political side of things as well and trying to make those, trying to get like democracy back in the hands of the community, because that's ultimately like, you know, the PSEF, that's what PSEF's doing, getting the power back into communities' hands, especially communities that have been left out of the conversation and at the table. So yeah, I'll leave it there.
If there are other questions, please send them to me. I'm Don Negri. It would be dnegri@willamette.edu. And I will try to forward them to our guests at some future time. I also want to let everybody know that this recorded video, Climate by 2030, wow, wait a second, something popped up there.
I accidentally paused the recording. Sorry about that. I started it again.
Okay. This will be available on the Solve Climate by 2030 YouTube channel. And we're hoping to make it available to schools to use as a class and discussion availability. And we will start advertising that to various high schools and whatnot shortly. And I want to thank all of you for attending, those of you out there in our audience, and especially to our three guests who taught us a lot about climate change and climate justice and their interaction. And with that, I think I will let everybody head home for the evening. Thank you very much.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
It's been an honor. Thank you.
Thank you all. Appreciate it.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.